Hello, everybody. Is it started at 7:30? I know you're having a really good social time. I'd like to give a land acknowledgement before we start. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Nations for the care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. And there are a few new faces here, and I'm Sue Pardisi, the president of the Field Naturalists. I should have said that first. When you came in, there was a poster up on the screen advertising our annual general meeting. And for those of you who are members, the invitation and all the information will go out tomorrow to your email. And hope to see everyone there. Charlene, could you come up, please? Charlene Ward is a new member, and I'm very happy that she has joined the PSN, and she has something for us.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Charlene Ward. Used to this. I've been
Just a sec, Charlene. Technical challenges here because the camera's there. There you go.
I've been growing native plants from seed for a few years now. So I had a few extra seeds that I was cleaning out. And I thought, well, what can I do with this instead of just, throwing them away? So I ended up making seed bombs. I've never really made them before, so I thought maybe I'd give it a try. And so anyways, I've got a few seed bombs, not many, and I'm so sorry for the folks back at home. But yeah, so a couple seed bombs in here, and the paper just kind of tells you what kind of seeds are in them. So there's not many, but some of them are packaged up as, for throwing off in a meadow, and some are packaged up for throwing off kind of in a marshland. And I would suggest not putting them in your own garden because there's a couple of species that like a lot of space in here. But
there's your warning.
this is a good time to throw them out because they do need some period. And so this is a good time for starting them. So the next time you're on a walk, throw these out and let's hope that something grows. So I'll leave them just at the back and you can pick them out if you wish. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Charlene. And there is a little clay mixture that's solidified, and it will break down in the rain and release the seeds, and hopefully lots of them will germinate. Exciting. Is Anne here tonight? I don't think she is. Does anyone in the room have any sightings? Linda? Yeah, we have a whiteboard at the entrance coming in. So going forward, when you come in, if you ever write your sightings up on the board, then Pam can announce them and put them in the orchid. Any sightings in the room? Other than what's on the board? And not just birds. Charlene? Oh, skunks. The skunks are starting to come out. Bill? Yeah. Yay. Anyone at home? Any sightings on Zoom? No. Okay. Yeah, there's a lesser black-backed gull down on Little Lake Creek, and glaucous gull as well. The lesser blackbacks are a real challenge to identify. Looks a lot like the young herring gulls that are there as well. But you get a good perch where they're not too far out on the lake and sit for a while, and you can make your way through them. I managed to figure them out. Marie had a chipmunk out already. came out of the hole on a cold day. Nature's as confused as we are. Yeah, the ground. He seems quite puzzled by coming out. And of course, there's been an awful lot of bird song. I think all of you have been out and about will have heard the birds singing. So it's all early. Yes, Fiona.
Ruth Mead online.
Ruth Mead online.
Has had robins 2 days in a row.
Robins 2 days in a row. That isn't terribly unusual because this winter there's been a lot of food available for the robins, so a lot of them did not go south. I have one that has been eating crab apples in my yard for quite some time now and was quite disgusted when a flock of cedar waxwings came in. And this robin was determined to send them all packing. And 2 bald eagles in one day. Excellent.
Maryland Freeman, trumpeter swan on the Otonabee River.
And Maryland Freeman, some of the trumpeter swans on the Otonabee River.
At River.
At River Road. There have been a pair on Little Lake as well. 2 days ago when I was down there, just as I arrived at the beach, they flew off and were flying all around the campground, the soccer fields, trumpeting as they went, then came back and landed on the lake and started doing the extended neck and into the heart shape. It's quite fascinating to watch.
Steve Paul reminds us of Sandy's caterpillar from last Friday's World Wetland.
Right, yeah, Sandy spotted a caterpillar on the trail last Saturday when we were on our, or the Friday when we were on our World Wetlands walk. What kind was it, Sandy? Do you remember? It'll be in the market. Okay, she'll send the photo with the captain. Yes.
I was talking to a farmer at UofT last Saturday, and he lived near Keene, and he was cutting down a tree, and he had to take off because he didn't know that there was a bee
Nest.
dragon in that nest, and they were quick from after. So they were stung by the winter.
Okay, yeah, apparently a farmer down near Keene was doing some tree removal, and there was a tree with a hollow that was full of very irate bees. So I think it left the scene likely. Okay, anything else to report at home or here? No. Okay, Kathy, is there anything really significant on the board there?
Morning doves, canoodling,
Morning doves canoodling.
northern terrier, fleet woodpeckers, our cardinal singing, uncles, kestrel, raven, bobbing, red-tailed hawk.
Miscellaneous. I'll leave that at miscellaneous. Okay, so outings. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the outings we've been having this winter. I had posted in the York back in the fall that over the winter months we wouldn't have specific dates, but short notice hikes whenever the weather was conducive and somebody was willing to lead a hike. And it's turned out to be a share a trail winter, because the first one was led by Marilyn Freeman on one of her favorite trails that she shared up to the east of Jackson Park and west of Fairburn. There's trails back in there. That was a great walk. And then Patrick Kramer shared one of his favorites along the shore of the Otonabee River across from Quaker. And they had some great sightings on that one. I did one at Ecology Park because that's my neighborhood, and we were looking at primarily at the trees. And then last weekend, Steve Paul shared his favorite trail, which is the Lang Hastings from Technology Drive to Key Road. And so with that theme in mind, if any of you have a favorite trail in the area that you would like to share, I'd be happy to promote it and send it out to the people who are interested, and we could meet with you and you could share your trail. So get in touch with me if you are interested. So, Phil, would you like to do the quiz?
Yeah, sure.
We'll be just a minute, we'll get set up.
I need to find my presentation.
Yeah, I'll be right after. Yeah.
This down.
Yeah,
Oh, sure, yeah.
eventually.
Let's share the screen. Somebody grab mine some directions. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. I had a few thoughts on ideas for a quiz, but I thought I'd go back to birds and see how we do. So I've got winter finches. Okay, so the first question is for the folks in the room. Okay, ready? Here we go. Any thoughts? It's a brambling. Yeah, you can keep the chocolate bars this time. Okay, we'll try the next one. Okay, this next one is for the online folks to first start off.
Oh, online, right. We have a goldfinch from Ruth. Marilyn Freeman,
Yeah.
goldfinch.
Correct. Okay,
Rosie finch.
yeah, that's correct. It's the gray crowned rosy finch. It's a female, so it's not as.
Where was that?
Western North America.
Western North America?
Huh. I looked up Ontario finches and some of these came up, so.
You're
Okay, this one I know I've seen this one with some folks in Ontario. This is for the room.
This is online.
Oh, this is online, sorry.
John and Robert DeFrucia say pine siskin.
Yeah, that's correct. That's right.
Kathy, you're not alone. Share.
Okay, we'll go back to the online folks.
This is online, right? Tell me.
This is online. Sorry.
Oh, Ruth Mead says grosbeak. What kind of grosbeak?
Wait, yeah, what kind of grows me?
Nick Lamont says pine grosbeak.
Yes, that's correct.
That's the female.
This is an easy one. Correct. House finch.
Where am I going? Marie.
Okay, this next one's for the online folks.
Yeah.
This is online.
Ruth says not sure. Crossbill? Question mark.
No.
Steve Paul says purple finch.
Yes, very good, Steve. Thank you. Somebody wants you to talk about Steve. Very good. There we go, everybody. Okay, let's go back to the online folks. Okay, for the online.
No answers yet. Steve Paul says evening grosbeak.
That's correct. Very good, Steve.
So does Marilyn Freeman, so does Rhode Addison.
Okay, there we go. Very good. Thank you.
Give us a minute. It does.
Switch around.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, very good. Well, while they're taking care of some of the IT here, I'll introduce our speaker this evening. We have Marcel Dorken from Trent University. Marcel is a professor at Trent University, is part of a research group that examines ecology and the evolution and the reproduction of plants. The students in his labs use field experiments and molecular genetics to study sexual selection and the evolution of separate sexes and evolutionary processes involved in invasive species and invasive plant invasions, along with plant pollinator interactions. Then the title of Marcel's talk is The Evolution and Ecology of Plant Reproduction, and he will be presenting on the topic of research that he's conducted at Trent University since 2008. And the main themes will include evolutionary transitions, reproductive systems, and sexual selection, and evolutionary processes in invasive plants. Good evening.
Presentation, and thanks for coming, everybody. Yes. It's okay. All right. I had a whole slide deck of spring, well, not entirely spring, some summer wildflowers to show you. Guess we won't do that, but we just, I've got one right here, and we just did a quiz. So what do you think? It's not that hard. Yeah, all right, we got it already. I'm sure a lot of you knew it, but anyway, paintbrush. And in fact, when Phil saw this slide, he could even tell me where the photo was taken. So yeah, carded plane. Oh no, so hawkweed is devil's paint. Are you thinking of devil's paintbrush?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So I think both of them or sometimes called devil's paintbrush. Yeah, yes. This was taken in June, mid-June, about 7-8 years ago. Yeah, Carden Plain, which is, everybody knows where that is?
Northwest.
Yeah, it's past the Kirkfield lift lock, yeah. Yeah. Okay, all right, so the reason I wanted to show a slide deck of all these summer flowers was to give an impression of the diversity of plants, right? And the plants, as I'm sure you all know, are incredibly diverse. You know, after the animals, and really that's just the insects, they're the most diverse range of plant organisms on the planet. And of course, they dominate terrestrial landscapes. If you go outside, and in this part of the world, and they're, you know, in the middle of Toronto or something like that, what you see is plants, right? So they're incredibly important ecologically. They're interesting evolutionarily. They're also important, incredibly important to us as people. I mean, that's what we eat. We get almost all of our food energy, or we get all of our food energy either directly or indirectly from plants. Okay. All right. That diversity. So a major challenge for evolutionary biologists is to understand where diversity comes from and what maintains it. And one of the drivers, there are lots of drivers of diversity in the flowering plants, but one of them is evolutionary transitions in the modes of reproduction. That's what we focus on in my lab. That's what we study. We'll also talk about invasive plants at the end. Where I want to start my talk this evening is to talk about evolutionary transition between modes of reproduction. And I wanted to feature a few plant species that we've been studying in this context. I'm going to leave out the second one because of time constraints. I thought I had an hour, and I don't. So I'm just gonna leave that one out. And we'll talk about swamp loosestrife and broadleaf arrowhead, and then we'll move on to talking about evolutionary processes in invasive plant populations, and talking about hybrid cattails, which are, you know, everybody's always surprised to hear it, but a really important invasive species in our part of the world. Okay. All right. So this slide here just gives a brief overview of outline of how I want to approach the topic of evolutionary transitions in modes of reproduction. I was going to focus on all three, but I'm just going to leave out the one in the middle this evening. So the vast majority of flowering plants are outbreeding and hermaphroditic, meaning that the plants combine both male and female sex roles within the same individual. But in thousands of different lineages, in different times in history, including many of these processes are ongoing. There have been evolutionary transitions from that outbreeding hermaphroditic ancestral state to these other modes here. I'm going to start by talking about the one at the bottom, which is the evolutionary loss of sex. And we'll focus in on northern populations of swamp loosestrife for that. I'm going to skip over the middle one, the evolution of inbreeding from outbreeding. That is probably the most common evolutionary transition in modes of reproduction. It is the most common evolutionary transition in modes of reproduction in flowering plants. It drives speciation. It's pretty important these days because of global change and pollinator declines and things like that. Inbreeding is favored under colonization when plants have to expand their range or shift ranges. Particularly in the absence of their pollinators, there's a strong advantage to being able to inbreed. So this evolutionary transition from outbreeding to inbreeding happens a lot, but we're going to skip over that one this evening. The final one I want to talk about is the evolution of separate sexes, so the evolution of males and females from hermaphroditism, and then within that context, talk about some relatively recent research on sexual selection in plant populations. We'll wrap it up by talking about these hybrid cattails, which are on the edge of this slide here. Okay, so swamp loosestrife. So this is work I did as a master's student more than 25 years ago. I had to scan in some old color slides I had, and it's like I had some Vaseline on my slide or something like that. But anyway, this is swamp loosestrife. I'm sure if you hang out in wetlands, you know this plant is quite common in our region. It's a relative. It's in the same family as purple loosestrife, but it's a native plant. The context here is the evolutionary loss of sex, and all across the northern range edge of this species distribution, there are asexual populations that do not engage in sexual reproduction. There are different signals for this. We've used genetic markers to confirm that these populations are entirely asexual. There's no sexual recruitment happening in these populations. The region I studied was in New England, but the same is true here in Ontario and Quebec, all across its range in Eastern North America. Where do I want to go with this? Well, when you're in these populations of swamp loosestrife, I'm going to keep this talk fairly high level. I do have some data slides I want to show you, but I'm going to try and keep things fairly general, just talk to photographs and, in this case, a map as well. So when you're in these populations at the end of the summer, and you're in the sexual part of the species range, the branches are just crusted with fruits. There's lots of fruits, there's seeds, they're viable seeds. The populations are undergoing regular sexual recruitment. We know this from genetic studies. But at the northern edge of the species range, you will find fruits. You can find the odd fruit like on this plant here, but there's no seeds in them, no viable seeds. There might be undeveloped seeds that won't germinate and so on. So there's no seeds being formed. And the question is, well, I've got the headline for this slide is that the evolutionary loss of sex is, I can't read it here, but driven by mutations that increase overwintering survival. So that's what's happening. Sex is being lost. That actually provides these plants at the northern edge of the species range an advantage in terms of their overwintering success. So we'll talk about, what I want to talk about next is the processes that are knocked out. So how these different plants have lost the ability to have sex in these different populations. And I guess I should say that we have clear genetic evidence that each one of those different circles represents a separate evolutionary loss of sex. So it's not just it happened once and that a single asexual clone just sort of spread throughout New England. It's happening independently in each of these individual populations. And the mutations that are interfering with sexual reproduction are operating at different stages of the sexual reproductive cycle. So successful sexual reproduction in plants requires a whole bunch of different stages, right? All starting with flower production and ending with the production, dispersal, and establishment of seeds and seedlings. And in between, there's a whole bunch of other steps too that are important. So plants need to produce viable gametophytes, so pollen and ovules. There needs to be the movement of pollen from one plant to another. That pollen needs to germinate and grow through the female reproductive tissues, fertilize ovules in the ovary, and then those seeds need to develop. And so I've provided a little diagram, just a little primer on sexual reproduction in plants in case it's been a while since you thought about this. But so what this diagram is the green column, and the fluorescing column in the middle of the slide is the female reproductive tissues, right? So at the tip, the fuzzy tip in the central image is the stigmatic surface where pollen lands, is deposited by a bee. That pollen lands and it sends a tube, it germinates and it sends a tube down through the female tissues, which is what those yellow lines are on the left-hand part of the slide. Those pollen tubes grow down, they have the sperm cells within them, right? So the pollen tube grows down towards the ovary, those little orangey, purpley, yellowy circles within the ovary, those are the ovules. And so the pollen tube grows down, enters the ovule and deposits 2 sperm cells within each ovule. Okay. All right, so this is sort of what it looks like. I've included this fluorescent, I didn't make these particular images, but this fluorescent diagram, pollen tubes autofluoresce under fluorescence microscopy. So that's what this central image is here. And so I didn't look at all of these different stages of the sexual reproductive life cycle. The ones that we investigated are the ones that are shown in bold on this slide. So these are the things that we measured in these northern populations of Decadon verticillatus, swamp loosestrife. We did this in the field, and we also brought these plants into the greenhouse. So the question is, well, maybe they're asexual just because it's too cold. They can't complete their reproductive cycle in these northern, colder climates. But if you bring them into a greenhouse, maybe they'll be just fine. Well, no, they're not. We looked at all this stuff in the greenhouse as well. And in these northern asexual populations of swamp loosestrife, each one of these different phases is knocked out, and it's often a different step in the sexual reproductive cycle that is knocked out in different populations. And remember, I said that there's separate evolutionary origins of the loss of sex in each of these northern populations. So they produce less. In some populations, there are very few flowers. In other populations, there might be flowers, but there's less pollen deposition on on the flowers. So there's often an impairment in the growth of pollen tubes. These, well, the yellow things shown, the yellow things that are being transmitted through the female reproductive tissues. Lower rates of ovule fertilization, and ultimately, all of those things, the culmination of that is that there's fewer seeds being produced. Okay, and I just want to show you some of what some of this looks like in terms of these. Well, I'm going to show you pictures of what these things look like in terms of the pollen tubes and fertilization. So on the right is what pollen tubes should look like as they're transmitted through the style. So remember, pollen tubes autofluoresce. So this is just a simple light microscope with a fluorescent light source that I made a squash of the female reproductive tissues, and it counted pollen tubes. That's what it should normally look like. But there's in almost all of the asexual populations, there's some impairment at some stage in the particular population. Well, the particular sample that I have a photo of here, there's an impairment in the growth of pollen tubes. Ovules are often malformed in these asexual populations, and if the pollen tubes ever get down there, those ovules aren't fertilized. So what it should look like is the pollen tube enters the ovary, and you can actually see this strand sticking out of this oval-shaped structure on the right-hand side is an ovule, and there's a sort of a fluorescent string sticking out of it. That's the pollen tube. It's penetrated the ovule, and it's will have at some point just deposited the sperm cells within the ovule. That's what it should look like. That's not what it looks like in most of these asexual populations. So there's been separate evolutionary losses of sex across the northern range edge of Decadon verticillitis, and subsequent studies of these populations shows that the loss of sex is associated with an overwintering survival. And there's at least two genetic mechanisms that are responsible for driving these loss of sex. One is these recessive mutations that knock out sexual fertility in these northern populations. And the other is polyploidy, so triploids. So for the same reason that the bananas we eat in the grocery store don't have seeds in them, at least some of these northern populations of swamp loosestrife are also sexually infertile. Okay, so that wraps up this brief overview of some of the research we've done. I don't know how this slide came up again. Oh, going in a loop. Okay, let's just get out of this loop here. And that's the part I'm skipping over on inbreeding. I want to talk a bit about pollination there, but we'll just move ahead to here. Okay, oh no. Oh, dear. Start current slide here. Nope. This is fun. This is fun. All right. I don't know. What am I gonna do? I guess I can just show it like this. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, but we'll just have to. This is not ideal, is it? Oh, yeah. Where did this loop? Where did this loop slide? Somehow. Let me just do that again. think the looping is off, so let's go back here. Okay. All right, we're almost happening. No. No, either. I'm gonna put the microphone down for a second.
From 1 to 16, how many slides?
Oh, that's- okay, right. Okay, I think you've solved it. Thank you. Yeah.
I get a job.
That's the problem between switching different platforms is surprises. Okay, so we just skipped over, and I have a brief diversion on PowerPoint. There's evolutionary transitions from outbreeding to inbreeding. We're going to move ahead to talking about the evolutions of male and females from hermaphroditism. And the part that's cut off at the top is sterility mutations. Part of this part of the talk is Sagittaria latifolia, broadleaf arrowhead. It's another common aquatic plant. In fact, I think all the plants now, there was one terrestrial plant I was going to talk about, but they're all emergent aquatics now, now that I've removed the part about inbreeding, is a broadleaf arrowhead. And it's fairly common in wetlands around here. You've probably seen it. And that's a male. So that sort of is a segue for this talk. And one of the really interesting things about Sagittaria latifolia, and one of the things that makes it really unusual among any plant or animal, is that populations can consist of either hermaphrodites, monoecious hermaphrodites. So what I mean by that, I'm going to try to not sling too many botanical terms at you, but hermaphrodites that have unisexual flowers. So here's a female flower and a male flower. And then in other populations, there are genetically distinct males and females. So sex is genetically determined. It's simple XY sex determination. There's a male that only produces male flowers and a female that only produces female flowers. And this having hermaphroditic populations of hermaphrodites and populations with males and females is really unusual. It's like the stage for enable some of the experimental approaches we've been using in the lab to try and understand how and why males and females evolve. And I have to skip over most of that work, and we're going to move towards talking about sexual. I do want to talk very briefly about what we understand about the evolution of males and females from hermaphroditism. I'll talk very briefly about the processes that we think are important in Sagittaria latifolia, and then move on to talking about sexual selection. Okay, so just another brief primer for those who haven't thought about sex in a while. So hermaphrodites, they produce both pollen, that's the diagram, pollen and ovules, right? Females only produce ovules and males only produce pollen. The sperm cells are in ovules, I've already mentioned that, and the egg cells are contained within ovules. And so all three sexes are present in Sagittaria latifolia, and males and females evolve from hermaphroditism. And that's the order in which these things always evolve in flowering plants. Hermaphroditism is the ancestral condition, and separate sexes evolve afterwards. And this transition has occurred hundreds of times, it's not more than 1,000 times across different lineages of flowering plants. Famous dioecious plants include things like Candace. Holly is dioecious. I'm sure you can name third dioecious plants. Anyway, arrowheads are dioecious. Anyway, so this is the order in which it occurs. But so evolution proceeds by mutation, right? That's the ultimate source by which, or process by which by which evolutionary transitions occur. But the interesting thing, one of the interesting things about this evolutionary transition is that the mutations that are involved are sterility mutations. Hermaphrodites can act as both a mother and a father to the seeds that are produced, and that then can make the next generation of plants in the population. A female can only produce seeds, and a male can only produce pollen. So what's happening here is that mutations are entering into these populations of hermaphrodites and knocking out the ability of those plants to be either a mother or a father. And on average, individuals in populations of outbreeding hermaphrodites gain half of their fitness through being either a pollen parent or a seed parent. So these mutations are knocking out, on average, half of a plant's way of, being fit in the Darwinian sense. So how do these Australian mutations, how can this evolutionary transition ever take off if we're talking about mutations that have such a drastic effect on fitness? I'll answer that question in a few slides. The other interesting thing about this evolutionary transition from hermaphroditism to separate sexes is that these mutations can't all occur all at once. They have to arise in populations sequentially, and that gives rise to these fancy botanical terms in which one plant is unisexual or is either a male or a female, and the other plant is still hermaphroditic. So these fancy botanical terms, I'll just say them. There's not going to be a quiz at the end. Gynodioecy and androdioecy. So gynodioecy refers to the situation in which females co-occur with hermaphrodites, and androdioecy is the complementary situation in which males co-occur with hermaphrodites. So here we have, the simplest scenario is that if we take this top pathway, we have a male sterility mutation occurring that would correspond with this arrow that knocks out the ability of at least some plants in the population to produce pollen, rendering those plants female. That would then be followed by a female sterility mutation that is expressed by hermaphrodites that renders those plants male, right? And then the opposite sequence of events would occur in the lower pathway. Now, it turns out, for all kinds of reasons that I won't go into, this is the pathway by which dioecy evolves. As far as we know, almost always separate sexes, dioecy, males and females, evolve by this upper pathway, with females evolving first. So females are the first unisexual phenotype that evolve in plant populations. And that's then followed by the evolution of males. And this is all supported by theoretical work and experimental studies that have been looking at these evolutionary pathways. Much of the work on the evolution of separate is focused on this initial pathway, the thing that gets the ball rolling, the evolution of females. Less work on the evolution of males. And that's actually some of the work that we've been doing has been focusing in on this second pathway. Okay, so gynodioecy. Are there any gynodioecious species around here? Yes, there are. There's quite a few actually. And the most common one is wild strawberry. So if you look closely at wild strawberries, this is a female, so maybe I shouldn't start with a female. I just have there's a pollen everywhere, so I included it here. But if you look closely at wild strawberries, most of the time you'll see this situation where there's a ring of stamens at the sort of, the center of the flower. The center of the flower has the female sex organs, where what we call a berry would normally be reproduced. And then outside of that there's a ring of male sex organs, the stamens here. So these are the pollen-bearing structures on sort of towards the outside of the center of the flower. So the female sex organs here and the male sex organs there. So that's the normal situation. But if you look closely around here, and especially if you go further north, you'll see females. So there's no male sex organs on these plants. These are genetic females. And in fact, in this particular population, there are actually males as well. And there's all kinds of interesting work that's been done on the evolution of males and females in strawberries. I haven't studied that myself, so I'm not going to talk about it. But strawberries you get in the grocery store are a hybrid that include this species and a species from Chile. So this is you've probably all tasted these strawberries yourselves, maybe. I don't know. You can eat them. And they're quite sweet tasting, but the fruits are very small. Anyway, okay. So a few slides ago, I told you that females always evolve first. Why do females evolve first? Well, they can benefit from inbreeding avoidance. Hermaphrodites, if they're self-fertile and they pollinate themselves, those offspring that are produced, those what will ultimately become seeds, are inbred, highly inbred, the most extreme form of inbreeding that there can be, because the mom of the plant is also the dad of the plant, right? So And as you're all, I think, probably familiar, that extreme form of inbreeding is usually associated with a reduction in the viability, fertility, vigor of the offspring, what we call inbreeding depression. And by being unisexual, a female can avoid all those problems. So it cannot inbreed because it doesn't produce any pollen. And moreover, females can benefit from what I've referred to here as resource compensation. So by virtue of the fact that they're not producing any male sex organs, they can reinvest those resources that they didn't use to produce pollen. And pollen is very nitrogen rich, and nitrogen is often limited in natural populations. They can reinvest those resources and make additional seeds. So, but we have good evidence that both of these things have been important in the evolution of separate sexes in Sagittaria latifolium and broadleaf arrowhead. Okay, so I've just explained why females evolved first, but maybe you might be wondering, well, how come inbreeding avoidance doesn't benefit males, or why doesn't resource compensation benefit males? Well, inbreeding avoidance doesn't benefit males because if hermaphrodites are inbreeding, all that does is reduce the number of seeds that a male could potentially suck the father of. So males don't get any advantage from this inbreeding avoidance that females can benefit from. In fact, it makes life harder for males if hermaphrodites are inbreeding. They can benefit from resource compensation, but in general, we think that that's not strong enough to enable the evolution of males. Males only have this ability to gain an advantage over hermaphrodites once females are already there. And so one of the first experiments that we set up when I started at Trent University 15 years ago was that we set up little mating trials. So we used molecular genetic markers a lot in my lab. And in this particular case, we used them for parentage analysis. So we made our lives easier by, well, let me just take a step back. So we set up these mating arenas. I'm calling them mating arenas. We use a slightly different term in the literature, but I think mating arenas make sense. We just had a series of plants, right? We set them up in a grid, and each of those grids had a single male and 5 females and 5 hermaphrodites. And each of them had different genetic markers that we could use to determine who was the dad of any particular seed. So we knew we could collect the seeds from the moms, from the hermaphrodites and the females. We knew who the maternal parent of each seed was, and we could use genetic markers to figure out who the dad of each seed was. Okay, so we did that paternity testing, and here's, like I said, I would keep this mostly high level, but here's some data. So the x-axis here is the proportion of flowers that were on that focal male. So this is, so in some of these males were really large, and there was a high proportion of all the male flowers in that mating arena were from that focal male. And in other mating arenas, a smaller proportion of those flowers in the arena were from that focal male. And the y-axis here is the proportion of seeds that were sired by that focal male. And all else being equal, we expect a one-to-one relationship between those two things, right? If males are just as good as hermaphrodites at founding seeds, we expect the data to follow along this one-to-one line. And that's what this dashed line here is, a one-to-one line. Now, the slope of this line, this solid line is the slope of the actual data, or the line that fits through the actual data, and the circles, one circle from each of the different mating arenas, the 10 different mating arenas that we set up. The slope of that line is 1, but the intercept is way higher than 0. It's substantially higher than 0. So males have an intrinsic advantage over hermaphrodites in terms of their ability to sire seeds on females. And that could reflect the outcome of sexual selection. So that's where we're moving to now. We're going to talk about sexual selection in plants. And sexual selection in plants has been something that, well, for a long time was a big question mark. And Darwin, the person who came up with the idea of sexual selection in the first place, downplayed or even suggested that it wasn't possible. And fairly early on, so after Darwin, in the sexual selection literature, it was thought that sexual selection was driven by things like female choice. So females are choosing males with attractive traits, for example, or direct like combat between males. Like you often see this in many mammal populations where males combat one another, fight one another for access to a group of females. Of course, neither of those things are, at least on the surface, possible in plants, right? So plants don't engage in combat. Although there are some actually surprising features of some milkweeds, African milkweeds, that are somewhat combative. But anyway, in a sexual selection context. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. There are actually physiological mechanisms of female choice that plants can engage in. There's good evidence for that. Regardless, it's not combat and female choice that drives sexual selection. The ultimate cause of sexual selection is the fact that one sex produces many small gametes and the other sex produces relatively few large gametes with a much greater resource investment in those gametes than the other sex. So that the fancy biological term for this, one sex produces many small gametes and the other sex produces fewer large gametes, is anisogamy. So this part refers to gametes and this part refers to the fact that they're not the same, right? So that's ultimately what drives sexual selection. Okay, plants are anisogamous. I've already mentioned the fact that plants produce sperm and eggs. It's a separate evolutionary origin of sperm and eggs. So it's not like plants and animals, they share a common ancestor billions of years ago, but there's been a separate evolutionary origin of sperm and eggs in the lineage that ultimately led to plants and a different one in animals. So anisogamies evolved a handful of times in eukaryotes, and plants and animals are certainly they're the most species-rich groups on the planet, but they're the two most species-rich groups that are also anisogamous. Okay, all right, so that's what drives sexual selection. How do you measure sex? So the point of that was that we expect sexual selection to operate in plants. Okay, the next question is, how do you measure it? There's lots of different ways that people have suggested measuring sexual selection, but the gold standard is what is referred to as these Bateman gradients. Now, more data. I guess it's late at night for this kind of stuff. But they're called these are called Bateman gradients because they correspond with, here's another biology lesson, Bateman's three principles. A.J. Bateman was a Drosophila geneticist from mid-20th century. Anyway, he did a whole bunch of behavioral studies of fruit flies and came up with what are now referred to as Bateman's principles. And the first of these principles is that males have much greater variance in reproductive success than females. And that's indicated here by this broad blue histogram on the y-axis, right? So there's just a lot of variation in reproductive success that we expect under anisogamy. Some males will have a lot of success and some will not, just by virtue of anisogamy. Males will also have greater variance than females in terms of their mating success. And the two of those together, this greater variance in mating success and reproductive success, will lead to a strong positive association between mating success and reproductive success in males, but not females. So what's happening here, and you can think of this quite easily in the context of sexual selection, a few males say they're the ones chosen by females or the ones that successfully exclude other males because of combat with them. They're the ones who get all the mating success. They're also the ones that get all the reproductive success, right? Females, why aren't females having a similar strong relationship between mating success and reproductive success? Well, females tend not to be mate limited in the sense that one mate is usually sufficient to, in the context of plants, fertilize all of her ovules. So that weakens the relationship between mating success and reproductive success for females. Okay, so how you measure sexual selection then is just by plotting the slope between mating success and reproductive success for males and doing it separately for females. And the difference in these slope values is the strength of sexual selection. This is the gold standard way to measure sexual selection. It's been done a few times in animals. It's been done once for plants in an experimental array setting, but we've never, well, until Allison, who's here in the audience, did this in natural populations. We never had any measurements of the strength of sexual selection in natural populations of plants. Okay, so that's where we're headed, the strength of natural selection in plants. But what about hermaphrodites? There's this wrinkle I've been talking about, males and females of Sagittaria latifolia. What about hermaphrodites? Do we expect sexual selection in that group as well? And yes, we do. In general, we expect it to be weaker but we do expect it. And sexual selection has been studied in animals. I have this slide up here to remind me to tell you that sexual selection should be a weaker force in hermaphrodites, and it's pretty easy to think of why. If sexual selection is driven by greater variance in mating success through the male role, if there's reciprocal mating, so these snails here, they're mating and they're mating reciprocally. If it mates through the male role, it may at the same time mate through the female role, and that means that there's the same number of mating events through the male role equals the number of mating events through the female role, and that means that those two things are correlated in hermaphrodites, and that weakens the difference between males and females, or the male and female sex roles in the figure I showed you on the previous slide. Okay, so we expect sexual selection, but we expect it to be weaker. That's the point I'm trying to say. And so Allison did all this work in natural populations. It was a huge effort. The reason it hadn't been done in natural populations before is because you need to mobilize a massive effort, molecular genetics, to do parentage analysis across many, many genetic markers. You need to deal with all the vagaries of working with plants in natural populations. But she did all this in two populations. One population of where there's males and females, and one population with hermaphrodites. And the fancy botanical terms for those things, I was trying to keep these down to a minimum, but they're important terms in the slides that are coming up, is that when females and males co-occur together, we refer to that as dioece, separate sexes, and when hermaphrodites, well, these are hermaphrodites, these are a particular type of hermaphrodites, monoecious hermaphrodites, because the flowers are unisexual. Okay, so the only reason for showing this is because those terms are coming up on the next slide after this one. So this is Allison. She's here in the audience today. This is her at work in one of the populations in which she measured sexual selection. And just remember, this is how we're plotting it. So the difference in the slope between the male and the female Bateman gradient is the magnitude of sexual selection. And these are data from the dioecious population that she studied. And I'm going to just leave aside all the blurry lines. Will focus in on the dashed lines. They're the average responses in each population. And you can see the slope for the male line in blue is much steeper than the slope for, in fact, the slope is almost negative, or barely negative, for females in this population of hermaphrodites. So there's a large difference in the slope between the Bateman gradient for males and the Bateman gradient for females, which is consistent with very strong sexual selection in this population. So this is the first measurement of sexual selection in a natural population of plants. So this is a dioecious population. I suggested a few slides ago that we expected maybe strong sexual selection in a population where there are males and females, but what about hermaphrodites? Well, we found pretty much the same thing in the population of hermaphrodites, a much steeper Bateman gradient for male function than for female function, consistent with strong sexual selection in monoecious populations as well. Okay, so this is the first time sexual selection has been studied and measured in natural populations of plants. It's also the first time that there's been a direct comparison between the magnitude of sexual selection in populations of males and females versus hermaphrodites. So that's the main contribution of this work that Allison put together. Main contributions. Okay, I'm running out of time, but I want to talk very briefly about invasive plants. We're going to focus in on these invasive cattails. This photo was taken just down the road on Nassau Mills. In fact, this is the Nassau Mills Road right here. And that's a patch of invasive hybrid cattails. Why am I calling them invasive? Well, if you ask wetland managers, particularly in the United States, where these are being intensively managed, now the slide will illustrate that in a second, these are really aggressive invaders in the sense that they form dense monocultures that exclude other wetland plants. They change the hydrology, they change the nutrient cycling within wetlands. They do that through rapid vegetative clonal growth, and they are partially fertile, so they can produce advanced generation hybrids and so on. They're capable of that. Okay, so cattails, I think in general, people around here don't see them as a problematic invasive species, but they really are. There are aggressive control efforts underway, particularly in the western Great Lakes region of the United States. So these are photos from a national park in Minnesota where they're using heavy machinery and fire to control hybrid cattails. What about in the top of the slide cut off? But this is just the top of the website from Point Pelee National Park. And the #1 invasive species that they list on the website in terms of problematic invasive species, it's not common reed, Phragmites, which I think many people are already aware of. It's hybrid cattails. It's the one that is most implicated in causing a decrease in open water habitats in Point Pelee National Park. So we haven't started these massive control efforts in Canada yet, but I don't know what we're going to end up to try controlling these things. In my lab, we're trying to understand where these things come from and what maintains them, and try to come at management from that perspective. And I'll circle back to that in a minute. First, I want to tell you about where these hybrids come from in the first place. We do have native cattails, and that's probably why hybrid cattails are flying under the radar a little bit. The native cattail in our region is the broadleaf cattail, Typha latifolia. It has a circumpolar distribution. It's native to North America. It has broader leaves than other taxa. And one of the ways you can distinguish it from other cattails, ultimately you need to use genetic markers to be 100% sure, but one of the common ways, if it has broad leaves and there's no gap between the male section of the inflorescence, these are the male florets up here, and the female florets down here, the things that become that brown cattail structure. There's no gap and broad leaves, you can be certain, it could be a hybrid, it could also be Typha latifolia. Typha angustifolia is the other parent of the hybrid. It has a broad distribution across Eurasia, and it was introduced to North America about 200 years ago, as far as we can tell. And it's the maternal parent of all the hybrids. I'll come back to that point in a second. One of the ways you can tell it apart is it has much narrower leaves, like substantially narrower leaves than Typha latifolia, and there's a gap between the male florets and the female florets. Okay, and the hybrids have, in general, they have intermediate characteristics. The leaves are intermediate width. There's an intermediate sized gap between the male and the female florets, but they're highly variable. And if I go back a couple slides, you can see that in a stand of hybrid plants, you'll see that some plants have the gap, some plants don't, and the leaves are variable in their thickness, or width. So the morphological characters are a guide, but they're not super reliable, especially in our region where we have a massive hybrid swarm. Okay, so the hybrids are formed when Typha latifolia, or native cattail, pollinates the introduced cattail and forms seeds, and those seeds disperse, and that's where those hybrids come from. It does not work in the other direction. So when the narrowleaf cattail pollinates the broadleaf cattail, no seeds are formed. At least no hybrid seeds are formed. Okay, so we know this through a bunch of hand processes we've done in the lab. And that's important in understanding the evolutionary processes that are happening in this hybrid zone. I say all this work on cattails has involved a collaboration with Dr. Joanna Freeland, also at Trent University. We've been working on these cattails for about 10 years now, I think, almost. And we've been doing a whole bunch of things. I won't read through this list. What we're interested in doing now is understanding the maintenance of these hybrids. We know that if you go beyond the first generation of hybrids, the second generation hybrids, or the plants that are back crossed to one of the parental species, they have lower fitness. And there's a lot of genetic diversity among F1 hybrids, suggesting that they're constantly being regenerated in these populations. So if we can stop F1s from being formed, we could, in principle, control the invasion of wetlands by hybrid cattails. So if we want to control the formation of hybrids, all we need to do is control this introduced narrowleaf cattail. And so what we're trying to figure out now is, are there any reproductive barriers that prevent or that promote pollination from one narrowleaf cattail to another, so that it continues to form pure narrowleaf cattail offspring, thus perpetuating the ability to form F1 first generation hybrid cattails. And so the reason we're particularly interested in this is that this is by far the least common type of cattail in our region. Most of the cattails in our region are these hybrids. There's quite a few native cattails left. This is relative, I mean, you can go out and you can find it, it's not like it's rare, but it is by far the least common one of these three taxa in our region. And because it's so common, you would think that most of the pollination events, so this is just a wind-pollinated plant, that most of the pollen that's landing on these, the female florets of this plant should be, you would think, all else being equal, either our native cattail or the hybrid. So what is maintaining pure Typha angustifolia, pure narrowleaf cattail in our region? Why is it not being genetically swamped by these other species? And so that's the question we're trying to work on now. I think if we can answer that question, we might come some way to understanding what's maintaining this narrowleaf cattail and therefore what's maintaining the formation of first generation hybrids in our region. Okay, that's, I think, all I had for you. Thank you for attention. Thank the students in my lab, particularly Alison, who's here today, and who've done almost all the work that I've shown you, aside from that Decadon stuff, and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council for funding my research. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's time for questions. Is there time for questions? Yes. Okay. Yes.
Coming back to your Decadon example, the top blue stripe, I noticed in New England, especially getting more towards the south, found populations of sexual language. They're finding co-occurring, and if you do, you ever see any evidence that there's competitive advantage going on in most?
Yeah, okay. So let's get back to the slide here. Excuse me. Okay, yeah. So the questioner noticed that there was an asexual population down here in southern Connecticut. And asked if there's if they often co-occur and if there's competitive advantage to asexual populations in that part of the world. Okay, I'll try to answer this one as best I can. Yes, they often co-occur. So they, if you look at the map of sexual and asexual populations of Decadon we're getting towards that part where you transition between mainly transition between sexual and asexual reproduction. Once you're up in Dorset, the populations are asexual. South of Auckland Park, you'll find a mixture of sexual and asexual populations. So yes, there is a mixture. In Connecticut, the Connecticut population is a bizarre one. So what knocked out sex in that particular population was some kind of mutation that prevented the formation of sex organs. So these were, we call them the carnationomes. These, there was, and these kinds of mutations in which one whorl of sex organs is replaced by a whorl of petals are not that uncommon. I mean, they're pretty uncommon, but that's where we get things like carnations from. So it was asexual by virtue of the fact that the plants produced no sex organs. And it was it looked like a highly polluted population. So I don't know what spurred this mutation towards its inability to produce sex organs in those flowers. Did it have an advantage? Well, that particular genotype was highly successful in that wetland. It was all over the place, and much more dominantly so than you would typically find in the sexual population of plants. But I can't. That's anecdotal. I don't. When we did the big greenhouse study, I was not able to collect plants from that population, so we don't actually know, other than the fact that whatever the mutation was prevented the sex organs from forming. We don't know what other effects on the phenotype that it had.
In the native range of Typha angustifolia, which I believe is Eurasia, has Typha latifolia managed to make its way over to that native range and sort of invade at any level?
Yeah, I don't have maps, so there's no point in cycling forward. But so the question is, with Typha angustifolia native to Eurasia, has Typha latifolia also, does it co-occur with Typha angustifolia in Europe? There are many parts of the world. Well, the answer is yes. Typha latifolia is native to Eurasia as well. So it has a fully circumpolar distribution. There are many parts of the world where those two species co-occur. It's only in our part of the world where we have this massive hybrid swarm. Hybrids are formed rarely in other parts of the world and not at all, apparently, in China, for whatever reason. But so there's something going on there in terms of genetic compatibilities. Something makes our native Typha latifolia compatible with Typha angustifolia. And presumably, and it's possible that this evolutionary process of a hybrid swarm, it may have played out in the past in Europe and before, and some form of reproductive barriers have evolved, and these kinds of things can evolve. It's called, the process for that is called reinforcement. Reproductive barriers between the two species evolve, and that prevents hybrid formation. But that hasn't occurred here yet, obviously. It may never.
Spend that half of your sexual and asexual plants in the United States. That some of them are clustered more in the high country in the north. And just generally, on the south. 50 years ago, Trent and I went down to Virginia and looked at gardens. So we were there before garden seed was really on. So we were wandering around and we met a fellow working in the Georgia University Arboretum. He asked what we were doing, and we said, well, we're down here for Virginia garden seed. And he said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, today I planted, I think he said, like 1 million trillions. Biologists, marriages, and it seems that down there, there's much more energy that can be directed towards reproduction. We know reproduction is the most expensive foreign consumer of energy in plants and animals. And it's there. There's lots of seed producing trillions. Up in the shield here, don't have so much seed production. It's climate or energy availability, one of the factors that drives us to evolutionary diversity that you're describing to us here. We've got these different strategies. And we know that evolution doesn't follow one common route.
Yes.
Energy, reproduction,
Yes. Okay, I will repeat the question as best I can. Okay, so in the southern parts of many species ranges, reproduction is more apparent, and plants tend to produce more seeds, more fruits, than the same plants do here in the northern edge of their range. If I've captured your sentiments accurately. And the question is, because reproduction is energy intensive and our growing seasons are shorter, climate is slightly harsher than further south, does that climate often lead to these kinds of evolutionary changes, such as I described for swamp blue strife with the loss of sex? The short answer is yes. The longer answer, I won't give you a long answer. The longer answer is that ultimately the climate is probably what enabled these mutations to be favorable in the first place. So the harsher winters. So as you pointed out, there's a strong trade-off between reproduction and vegetative vigor. This is true in plants, it's true in animals, although we wouldn't say vegetative vigor in animals, but anyway. So there are great costs associated with reproduction, let's put it that way. If a plant can save on those costs and reallocate those resources to, say, overwintering survival in a harsher winter environment, there is an advantage to that. And that's ultimately what we think is enable those mutations to have a selective advantage in those populations of swamp blue strife and to take hold, and ultimately to enable those populations to become dominated by a single large clone. So these are large clones, entire lakes, right? Just a single clone of swamp blue strife all the way around. So So yes, and there's an even longer answer, but I can save that for maybe after the question period. Yes.
So given that, would you expect the line or the margin of asexual versus sexual to start migrating north?
That's an interesting question. So ultimately, yes, we would if there's no longer a survival advantage for these clonal genotypes. The winters are no longer as harsh. Often, sex does have its own advantages, and sex is associated with diversity, variability, and often that variability comes with its own advantages. So yes, I think ultimately we would expect as long as those sexual genotypes can get established in those populations, they may be able to spread. Yes. Those I haven't gone back to those populations in 25, 30 years. So, but maybe it's worth a revisit.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes.
You say that group of plants in Maine, for less sexual reproduction, but going north into Canada, the sexual reproduction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're about this latitude here, aren't we? Toronto, like Peterborough, aren't we about this latitude? I think so. That'd be my guess. So I think it's all in line. Like we're definitely not as far north as the central parts of Maine. So I think well, the question is where we have this mixing in Maine. Is that not further south than where we are now? But I don't think it is. I guess I should have completed the map and included Ontario. It would have been. I don't know. I don't think so. But Algonquin is about the latitude where you get this switch from sexual to asexual. So I think it would roughly correspond with this latitude. Yeah, everybody has to get their phones out and double check. Yes. We're way further north than southern Maine. Well, okay.
We're in line with New Hampshire, about the middle of New Hampshire.
We're in line with the middle of New Hampshire here in Peterborough. I mean, Google Maps can be a little. You have to look at a map with lines of latitude drawn.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It depends on how the map was projected. Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I'm being fact checked. Yes. Do bugs have anything to do with it? Okay, the question is, do bugs have anything to do with the evolution of males and females in plants? Is that the question? Well, yes. So there was on arrowheads, it was thought that differential herbivory of males versus, the arrowheads are eaten by a bunch of specialist weevils. And some of them specialize on the female sex organs, the fruits, developing fruits. It was thought that there was a hypothesis that the fact that these weevils preferentially attack the female fruits, and because hermaphrodites monoecious hermaphrodites of Sagittarius latifolia tend to produce very few female fruits, that the weevils would just completely overwhelm the seed producing ability of hermaphroditic Sagittarius latifolia, and that would then give an advantage to females who are producing way more fruits than hermaphrodites. So yes, it is possible that insects can help trigger the evolution of separate sexes in plants. And there's, in fact, including in the species that we looked at tonight, a hypothesis that that's the reason why it happened. Okay. All right.
I'd like to say thank you to Marcel for coming and another presentation for us.
All right. Thank you, Phil.
We'll share it for you.
Thank you very much.
And then next month we'll have our AGM.
Yes, because next month, March, is our AGM meeting. There won't be a members meeting here at the Environment Center. So hopefully we'll see you all at, or on the trails or at the AGM. March 27th here in Peterborough. At the Peterborough Golf Country Club, and all that information will be in your email tomorrow. Good night, everyone.